Hello class, this is Dr. Brenda Craner, and this recorded lecture is to introduce you to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. While some of you may have already had it, which is wonderful, those of you who haven't, welcome to this brief introduction. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, it's as it mentions here, is a statistically validated tool that supports effective communication, leadership, team building, relationship development, so on and so forth. So essentially it looks at your personality style, but it looks at your personality style from a different perspective other than behaviors that you can recognize. It also differs from strengths, which focuses on your natural talents. This looks at labeling, if you want to say that, your personality on 4 different spectrums. So at this time, most likely you will have completed the assessment. The assessment is extremely short and it can be found in the content section under week 3 in pilot, and it's called, I think, the MBTI short version assessment summer 2020. So it's really quick, but it is fairly accurate. Now you can also go online and you can look for all sorts of free versions of the MBTI, and feel free to take those as well and see if you come out consistently the same. What I plan to do during this lecture is give you an opportunity to self-assess. So not only should you have most likely taken the assessment by now, but there's also an MBTI handout that can be found in the content section under week 3 as well. You can go ahead and print that out, or at least have it accessible where you can mark it up, underline it, circle it, or highlight it, because I'm going to have you do what we call self-identify as you go through. And so while you took that assessment and you were assigned 4 letters, when we actually talk about each of the letter types, it'll give you an opportunity to decide, do you think this is you? Do you not think this is you? And then at the end, you'll look to what degree did what you felt based on what you read in this handout represented you versus what that assessment did. So these are the 4 different preference, as they call them, pairs. So you've got everything. So the first scale is an E to I. I'm going to give a brief overview to start, and then we'll get deeper into each letter as we progress. So the E versus the I are on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, and the E and the I deal with how you receive energy. So at the end of the day, if you're exhausted, do you prefer to do things to recharge that are more focused on an extrovert or more focused on an introvert? So this is where you get your energy, where you recharge your batteries. Sensing versus intuition, the S or the N, is these 2 letters are based on how you like to take in information, how you like to gather your data before you make a decision. The T and the F are related to how do you come to a conclusion and actually make a decision. And then the final one, the J and the P, for judging and perceiving, is how do you approach the outside world? So this is the bigger perspective. These are the J and the P is what you can see more so from an individual than the E and the I, the S and the N, and the T and the F. The first 3 letters are things that go on inside someone's head that then are acted out. And sometimes you really have to get to know people before you can determine whether they're an E or an I. That sometimes is obvious, but not as much as the J and the P. And the S and the N, the T and the F can be difficult to recognize on the surface. So that's your introduction to the 4 preference pairs. And this slide essentially shows you there are 16 different ways for the preference pairs to be mixed up. So you'll essentially get a 4-letter type, and this is the diagram, and you'll see this numerous places online, that then has a general description of each of the different 4-letter or 8-letter total combinations, but 4 that actually show up. So it's called sometimes the 16 type personality assessment. So why do people use the MBTI? I've had numerous organizations over the past 20 years who I have worked with who really prefer the MBTI. One is it's a tried and true tool that's statistically validated across various industries and populations. But when you really get into the MBTI, you can really discover how to best work with other people, as well as how and why people interact in conflict situations the way they do, and the way in which they choose to resolve them. Also, it gives you perspective on how you make decisions. I don't go into that very much in this introduction, but different styles, dependent upon your preference, make decisions differently. Some are, which can create conflict in the workplace, especially if you're making decisions in a team environment. So it also gives you an opportunity to figure out, okay, who would be best to lean on to analyze a situation versus sometimes you're going into a big culture change in an organization, and often an individual or a handful of people who focus strongly on an F may be beneficial because transition can be very emotional, and recognizing the impact on the people is important versus the logical approach to making a decision, which is also needed, but the balance can be critical in order to ensure a successful transition of a culture. A few other things I want to point out about the MBTI is one, it's a theory. So really, it takes real life experience to validate it, which is why I have you do a self-identification exercise throughout this recording. And it's only one way to explain human personality. You've got the DISC, that's another type of personality assessment. You've got social styles, you've got the Clifton Strengths. So there are different ways of assessing personality and the reasons behind why. There's the Enneagram, which is huge and very complex. So there are different ways to explain human behavior, human personality. One of the biggest things to realize is it's no excuse for a specific behavior if it is toxic in an organization or within a team environment. And also, knowing personality style according to the MBTI doesn't solve every problem. It gives you insight. And what you choose to do with that insight will make a difference for your team and ultimately your organization. So now we're going to start looking at the different preferences. What's a preference? A preference is just how you prefer to recharge your batteries. How do you prefer to gather information? How do you prefer to make a decision? How do you prefer to orient your world? So it's things that are important to you based on who you are. So if we look at the first slide here, E versus I. So this is the energy flow. Extroverted individuals are outer focus. They prefer interacting with others, focusing on their outside world. Introverted individuals, they prefer inward focus, reflecting, reading, relaxing, things that are more individual based than outwardly focused. So what I would like you to do right now is on the MBTI handout that you have, pages 5 and pages 6. What I would like you to do is when I say go, pause this recording and with a highlighter or a pen, circle or underline, highlight go through each of the items and highlight the ones that really, really sound like you. For example, extroversion. You're sociable and outgoing. You recharge your batteries by playing with people, working with people, talking to people. So highlight the ones that really, really resonate with you. Feel free to glance through both pages before you do anything, just to kind of have a big picture perspective. When you go to page 6, do any of those sound like you? Highlight them, circle them, underline them. Keywords on the left at the bottom of each page. These are some keywords that define that type. The stressors are things that tend to stress you out if you are in a situation where you have to do it. So I would say stress you out or drain your battery, drain your energy. So then what you do, you look at those, you highlight them. The page that you feel most reflects you, that represents a letter. Page 5 is an E and page 6 is an I. Then you go back to page 3 and you circle the E or the I. Whichever one you feel best represents you in terms of how you get your energy, okay? And once you're done with that, go ahead and start the video again, and we'll go on to the next letter. So just for the record, if we were in the classroom together, I would put you in separate parts of the room based on whether you felt you identified most with an E or with an I, and ask you to describe an ideal vacation. Your organization gave you $5,000 a person, you're putting it together, and you all need to agree on a location and the events that you would participate in on a vacation. And 9 times out of 10, the E's are going to a beach, on a cruise, bar hopping, events, amusement parks, keeping busy. And the I's tend to want to go fishing, go exploring nature, hikes, laying by the beach, reading a book, possibly golf. So I'm not sure if that reflects your letter or not, but that typically happens in a workshop environment where I facilitate this workshop. So now we're going on to the N or the S, and that represents how you prefer to take in information. So if you look on page 7 and 8 of your handout, the S is on page 7. If you read through those, an S tends to be more fact-oriented, more practical, more specific, and N tends to be more possibility-oriented, vision-oriented, idealistic. So same thing you did with the E and the I, go ahead and do the same thing with the S and the N. How do you like to take in and gather information when you're learning or before you make a decision? Go ahead and stop the recording, highlight, circle, do the same thing you did with the pages 5 and 6, and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, so now we're moving on to the thinking versus feeling aspect of the MBTI. And going back to the S and the N, typically in a classroom environment, I have a random object with various shapes. I bring an S to the front of the room. They describe that random object without the audience watching or looking. They are to draw, cannot ask questions, the object. An S typically describes the object using terms such as diagonal, vertical, 90 degrees, 45 degrees, a third of the way down the page. An N tends to describe the picture when it's their turn to share it with the class, and they say a crescent moon, a diamond, an arrow, down, up, to the right, not as descriptive. So if that fits you, and the letter that represents you, that gives you a little bit of insight. So now we are looking at the T, the thinking and the feeling. So we've gone from where you get your energy to how you gather information, and now we're at how do you make decisions. So a T tends to be more objective, more analytical, and tough-minded. They consider what makes sense, what's just, what's logical. And F thinks about, well, what feels fair. They're a little bit more understanding. They tend to consider the person, not that a T doesn't, but an F tends to think about, okay, what's the most compassionate decision to make? T is more like, what's the most just decision to make? So there tend to be, obviously, you can see the continuum of differences. So looking at page 9 and 10, go ahead and stop the recording, highlight the ones that you feel you most identify with, and then go back to page 4 and circle the T or the F. Totally forgot to mention that on the S and the N. You should have gone back to page 3 and circle either the S or the N. So go ahead and stop the recording, and then I'll meet up with you so we can talk about the last one. So the activity I typically do for the T and the F is I break them into groups and then I have them describe or define the word conflict. Typically, the T's define conflict as a disagreement, what else should they say? A disagreement, a discussion, an argument. The F's tend to say feelings are hurt, people are upset. It's more emotional than the T's, which are more of just a descriptive definition. So. All right, so let's go to the J and the P. This is the one that tends, I will just say, to create more conflict in the workplace and in your home environment. So it's how you orient your outer world. So J for judging gets kind of a negative rap, in my opinion, because I'm not sure why it's called J completely, but J's tend to be more structured, more organized. They like closure. They like a plan. They like agenda, to-do lists. P's, laid back, go with the flow, whatever. I had a colleague of mine, we used to do a lot of training together. I'm very, let's have a plan, let's be structured, let's time it out. My colleague, on the other hand, was, we'll just go with it. Let's see what happens. I think we got this. We're experienced. We can roll with it. And it was a lot for me to be able to manage. So just a quick example off the top of my head. So page 11 and 12 in your handout gives you examples. So same drill, go through, highlight. How do you like to orient to your outer world? What do you need in order to be able to focus, to feel okay at work, in a group environment, what have you? So agenda versus no agenda, things of that nature. Go ahead, stop the recording, and after you've completed the highlights and circled the J or the P on page 4, press play and we'll wrap it up. So now that you've participated in the lecture and you've completed your assessment, what's your type? Are you an E or an I, an S or an N, T or an F, a J or a P? So your final assignment is to access the MBTI summary report. It's actually a template. You can pull that up and it walks you through the next step. One is to identify what your 4 letters are. You can go with either the one you self-identified as or the one that the report shared with you. It's whatever you feel best represents you. And then you'll share the overall description of your type. Feel free to go use descriptions you can find online. There are plenty of them out there. Then explain how your behaviors, actions, and interactions with others actually affirm each letter in your type preference. So then you'll go through and you'll do, I'm an E, and this E is evident in the way I do X, Y, and Z, and then share a little bit of this. All of this report will go into your ePortfolio for those of you who are minoring in OL or majoring in OL. You'll want to make sure it's something that you would reflect well written. Obviously, that's going to be a part of it. A well-written essay that essentially demonstrates that you've reflected on what each of the letters means and how it plays out in your daily life. And then the very last question on this summary report is, as a leader, my type preference of the 4 letters is beneficial because. Now, there are so many tools out there for MBTI and leadership. So you may be able to find some things online or just go with your gut. Why do you think your Myers-Briggs type indicator letter preferences are good from a leadership perspective? How do they contribute to strong leadership as you've seen it in your world and the organizations that you have been associated with? And with that concludes our recorded session for the introduction to the MBTI. Once again, do want to emphasize that none of the 16 are better than the other. They all have their benefits and contributions they make to teams and organizations. Take care.